Hey there BookTube, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm sharing my February reading recap. In February I read a total of 9 books. They were all fictional stories and I read a total of 2,200 pages. In February, my focus was on reading books by African American authors because I wanted to celebrate the Black History Month. However, during the month, I adjusted my TBR slightly because I wanted to read books by authors of African descent, but that came from other places in the world. So without further ado, let me share with you the books that I actually read. The first book that I read was The Star Side of Bird Hill by Naomi Jackson. This book takes place in Barbados. It follows two sisters, 16-year-old Dion and 10-year-old Phaedra. They've been living with their mother in Brooklyn, but after a bout of unemployment and the subsequent depression, she sends them to Barbados to spend the summer with her mother. Things that I liked about the book: I liked the cover. I thought the cover was really attractive, and if I'd seen this book in the bookstore, I would have picked it up just for the cover alone. I also enjoyed reading a book that was set in Barbados. I've never read a book that was set there before, and I have a lot of friends in Barbados who talk about the country, so it was interesting just to see the things that they have talked about being included in this work of fiction. Things that I didn't like: I didn't connect with the characters. I felt like a lot of the situations that were described were a little unrealistic based on my knowledge of West Indian people and West Indian habits. I didn't always feel like the voices were authentic to the characters, and I think that the author overused the element of tragedy in the story. There were a lot of things that happened, catastrophic things that I didn't feel achieved a purpose in the book, but were kind of just there for emotional tear-jerking moments, which I didn't appreciate. So in the end, I rated this 3 stars. Next, I read Adulthood is a Myth by Sarah Andersen. This is a short comic, and my first impression was that this book was beautiful. Just holding it and interacting with it was a beautiful experience. The cover is textured, and the comics are really well drawn and also really funny. This was written and illustrated by the same person, and it is the first book in a collection entitled the Sarah Scribbles Collection. I really enjoyed reading this book. Like I said, the comics were really funny, and it gave a humorous look on the challenges and complexities and kind of absurdities of being an adult, of being this person that people consider to be knowledgeable and responsible, but not always feeling up to that challenge. So I really enjoyed this book and I gave it 4 stars. Next up was See Now Then by Jamaica Kincaid. This is classic Jamaica Kincaid style. She talks about a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Sweet, who were living in New York City but have now moved to Vermont. Mr. Sweet is a failed musician / composer, and his wife is a stay-at-home mom / freelance writer. She's very successful at her craft, so she's the one who supports the family financially. Mr. Sweet is very resentful of that. He's resentful of his wife in many different ways. He resents her bringing them from New York to Vermont, which he blames as the reason that his career is not working out. And he carries that resentment through every element of their relationship. So the book was a really interesting look at the complexities and the challenges of a relationship, especially a relationship where people no longer see themselves as equals. The title See Now Then was about, if you were able to see into the future, how would that affect the decisions that you make now? So if you could see now, being the present, then meaning in the past, how would that have affected the decisions that you would have made? Jamaica Kincaid's style is that she fictionalizes elements of her real life and uses repetition to get you to focus on the thing that she considers to be most important in the story. She used her real life children but gave them the names of Greek god and goddess so that you could make connections between her children and the characteristics that she wanted to portray in her children and connect those with mythological creatures. I thought that was really interesting. I really enjoyed reading this book, and you can tell I put a lot of post-its in this book. Even though it's a library book, I put a lot of post-its, I put a lot of notes in it, so I gave this 4 stars. Book 4 was a collection of short stories entitled Mexico Stories by Josh Barkan. The central theme in these stories was crime, and All the stories take place in Mexico City or some part of Mexico, and they follow everyday characters, normal characters going about their regular routine lives until one day crime just kind of shows up on their doorstep and forces them to make really difficult decisions, sometimes endangering their lives, sometimes turning them into criminals themselves. The stories, they weren't connected, but you could see elements of one story kind of mirrored in another story. And like I said, the central theme was on crime, and the stories were very gripping. Some of them were graphic, but all of them were interesting. I really enjoyed reading this. If there was anything that I would have changed, however, was the title of the story. The fact that the stories are entitled Mexico and they are about crime kind of suggests that crime is one of the major characteristics of this country. I think that that is too much of a stereotype. Yes, I'm sure there's crime that happens in this country. I'm sure that some of the things that were mentioned in here are real. But to make a book about crime and entitle it and give it the title of a country, I thought was not quite politically correct. But I could see where the publisher or the author might have come up with this, because it's an attention grabber. It is the reason why I chose to read this book. So I guess it worked. I gave this collection 4 stars. Oh, and Josh Barkan is not an African-American author. He is actually a Caucasian American who lives and works in Mexico City. But I liked that little bit of diversity by visiting another country. But after that, I went back to reading books by Black authors, and the next book that I chose was Here Comes the Sun by Nicole Benn. She is a Jamaican who lives in New York, and this book takes place entirely in Jamaica. It follows a family, a mother and her 2 daughters, one adult daughter who is in her late 20s, I think, and the other who is a 16-year-old who's in high school, just about to sit her exams. The family, they live in extreme poverty. They live in a squatter community. The older daughter works in the hotel, and the younger daughter, her entire responsibility is to go to school, get good grades, become a doctor, and become a successful doctor and rescue her family from poverty. So everything that this mother and her older daughter have and do is focused on getting the younger daughter an education. The author tackled issues like homosexuality, prostitution, crime, poverty, the after effects of colonialism, tourism, and the impact that tourism has on local culture. There were a lot of issues that this book dealt with, but I didn't like the way that the country and the people of Jamaica were represented here. While I do agree, I am Jamaican, while I do agree that a lot of things that were talked about in this book actually do happen, I didn't feel like the author truly represented the full spectrum of the country. Like, after reading this book, if you are not familiar with Jamaican culture, if you're not familiar with Jamaican life, you might come away from reading this book thinking that this is all that Jamaica is, that all the people there are exploitive, that they take advantage of the people they're in relationships with so that they can get ahead. And I don't think that that is true. I didn't feel like it represented me or anyone that I knew who is Jamaican. So I felt like I needed someone, even one character that was good in this book, and there weren't any. There wasn't a single person in this book that was good. I also didn't like the way the book ended. Like, throughout the book, we're following these 3 characters. At the end, one of them kind of disappears, and the others, like the things that they've been working on throughout the whole book, at the end of the story, they just kind of let them fall away. So I enjoyed elements of the book, so I don't want to be grudgeful, so I gave it 3 stars. Book number 6 was What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours by Helen Oyeyemi. Helen Oyeyemi, she writes books about magical realism, and this short story collection was no different. There were elements of this book that were otherworldly, supernatural, and it combines with just regular characters who are pursuing just normal everyday things. The central theme of these stories was about keys and locks, and so every story had a different plot, different setting, but dealt with the issue of finding a key to a lock that someone has put in place. The characters from one story reappeared in another story, so the stories were linked in that way, and it showed kind of the development of these characters. So a character would be mentioned here when they were children, but mentioned a little later when they were in a different stage in their life. The magical realism also you can tell from the cover, because here it is, this person is making shadow puppets on the wall, but the puppet shadow is actually of a real dog. So you can tell from the book that this is kind of what you're gonna have going in. So I really enjoyed this. I gave this 4 stars. I think Helen Oyeyemi is a brilliant writer. I think she's a British-born woman of Nigerian descent or something like that. So her background is British but Nigerian. And so I really enjoyed this. The stories are set in England, and so that was another place that I visited in February. The next book that I read was Human Acts by Kang. No, she's not African American. She is a South Korean author. You might remember her from The Vegetarian that she published last year, and she won the Man Booker International Prize for that one. This book, I assume, is also going to win an award. The book is brilliant. So here's the background to the story. In May 1980, some civilians in South Korea started to protest the government. The government's response was to declare martial law and start attacking the people. Over the course of a few days, dozens or maybe up to hundreds of people, hundreds of civilians were killed. This story is about that uprising, about some of the people that died, and the impact that this uprising and the killings had on the rest of their society, on the people that knew them. The book is brilliant. The writing is haunting. It was graphic. It was detailed. Totally recommend this book. 5-star read all the way. Book number 8 is Best Laid Plans and Other Disasters by Amy Rivers. I have to tell you, after reading Human Acts, I needed a palate cleanser. And the very night that I finished Human Acts was the night I picked this up so that I could get some sleep. And I read this entire book in a night. It's just about 224 pages. And I read it really quickly, which is something that I appreciate in books like this. Best Laid Plans and Other Disasters is book 2 in a series by Amy Rivers. The first book was entitled Wallflower Blooming, and it follows 2 cousins, Gwen, who has political ambitions, and her cousin Val, who's a PR consultant, and together they launch a campaign to make Gwen the mayor of Cambria, Colorado. Book 2 happens now that Gwen has the job, and it's following some of the challenges that she faces working in this kind of environment. Where book 1 followed Val, book 2 follows Gwen, and we kind of see both of them but from different perspectives. It was a really fun, quick read. I rated this 3 stars. I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to the 3rd book in the series. Hey there, Amy Rivers, if you're watching, send out book 3 soon. Fresh off that simple read, I rounded out the month with Radiance Off Tomorrow by Ishmael Beah. Ishmael Beah is from Sierra Leone. He is one of the survivors of the civil war that happened in Sierra Leone a few years ago. The book takes place after the war. So what of the survivors of this war? What happens after they have survived and now try to return home and try to mend their lives, try to establish new relationships, try to move on with their lives? In the author's note, Beah talks about the difference between his native languages and English, where his native language is very poetic. So he used some of the flowery prose to make very horrific scenes more readable. There were a couple of times in this book that I was taken aback by some of the things that were happening, but also able to just appreciate the way he wrote about them. The book is written in 3rd-person narrative, which means that you get an eagle-eye look at everything that's happening in the village. You're not limited to just following like 1 or 2 characters. But where that narrative kind of broke down for me was where he started to now tell you the motivations behind people. And he kind of flipped back and forth between what's happening now and how this thing is going to impact the community later. So what's happening now, but here's also how this is going to change their lives in 6 months. I didn't quite like that. In the end, I rated this 3 stars. There were elements of the book that I really enjoyed. There were things about it that dragged, and even though so many things impacted me, I just couldn't justify giving it a 4-star rate. I'll tell you more about this when I do a closer book. So that was my February reading recap. Of the 9 books that I read, 6 were by authors of African descent. I also visited 6 countries during my reading experience in February, so that's a win. I'll do a recap of my Emoji-a-thon experience because I just can't fit anything else into this video. And I guess I'll talk to you about that later. So leave me a comment down below if you've read any of the books that I talked about, if you think that I should rate them a little higher based on your own experience. And, you know, let's chat. Subscribe to my channel if you're not already. And I'll talk to you later. Until then, happy reading.